The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, the first in Peter Jackson's Middle-earth adaptations, came out at just the right time to leave a truly indelible mark on my life. Not only was I, at 14, full of wide-eyed innocence and optimism, perfectly primed to be enraptured by the fantasy, swept away in the heroism, and genuinely shaken by the evil. As an aspiring filmmaker struggling to find his own voice, I was so ready to encounter a wizard of a filmmaker who brought his unique style and personality to a film, proving that I could potentially, one day, do the same. And for those very immediate and personal reasons, The Fellowship of the Ring quickly became my favorite film of all time. But what's been really fantastic is, after 15 years of repeat viewings, I'm still able to discover new elements of this film's craft and artistry that allow me to, without hesitation, herald it as one of the all-time cinematic greats. Now, in looking at The Fellowship of the Ring, no analysis would be complete without at least a momentary examination of its director and how his felt presence in nearly every frame aided in its success. This is Peter Jackson. This is Peter Jackson. And this is Peter Jackson. And I focus now on Jackson's love, dare I say infatuation, with gross-out imagery, not simply because it's a touchstone of nearly every one of his films, but because the vile character of Lurtz really was a paradigm for all of Jackson's directing. The actor beneath that prosthetic makeup, Lawrence McCorhay, had the absolutely monumental task of punching through the inches of silicone and rubber to display anger, rage, malevolence, and cunning. Likewise, Peter Jackson had the monumental task of punching through the pages and pages and pages of mythology, exposition, characters, creatures, races, geography, and plot lines to tell a coherent, cohesive, and captivating story. And he did so by, as he described it, regarding first the needs of people who loved cinema. This film had to work for those who had never once heard of a hobbit or an orc, or could care less about the properties of pipeweed or the proper name of Eomer, son of Eamon's sword, which is Guthwine, if you were wondering. And so he and his co-writers, Philippa Boyens and Fran Walsh, very bravely chose to start in a place that was unafraid to make changes to a beloved book, trimming and sometimes hacking, embellishing and sometimes creating from scratch. So, to go back to the character of Lurtz, that PJ creation was a prime example of the writers personifying and extending the reach of Sauron and Saruman, respectively, villains who couldn't really pose a physical threat to our heroes, one being a flaming eyeball and the other confined to his tower. And on top of that, his existence allowed for a much more personal and emotional showdown between Boromir and Aragorn at the film's climax. And really, at every turn, the filmmakers sought to tell Tolkien's story in terms that were uniquely cinematic. So yes, the opening prologue was in part designed to exposit some of Middle-earth's history.
One ring to rule them all.
But it was also crafted like the opening of a Bond film, throwing us into an exciting action sequence that would leave us completely in the hands of the filmmaker. But structurally, Peter Jackson's cinematic mind was no more evident than in the focus point of view infused into this film. This novel was sprawling, epic, nuanced, and often encyclopedic in detail, and to merely transcribe that would have been drudgery, not a film. So the writers elected to tell this story Frodo-centrically, mercilessly removing anything that didn't relate either to Frodo or the ring, giving this story the propulsive and focused backbone that it needed to succeed on screen. And even while sections like Rivendell or Lothlorien probably wouldn't exist in an original screenplay, they were adapted to communicate the enormity of what Frodo had been thrust into, and tailored to force him to own this quest.
I will take the ring to Mordor.
And understanding the centrality of the struggle within Mr. Baggins makes it perfectly clear why the originally scripted action climax, with Frodo battling an orc on the shores of Amon Hen, was cut. That scene needed to be about Frodo facing off against his true enemy, the ring, and sacrificially choosing to make the rest of this journey alone. Though, of course, as we know, his faithful friend Samwise Gamgee couldn't let that stand. Which brings us to another outstanding achievement on this film: the handling of its numerous characters. And with 9 members of the Fellowship and an Arwen, Galadriel, Elrond, and Saruman to boot, this film could have easily choked had they given equal attention to all of those characters. On the flip side, were they to have drawn them too thinly or treat their characterizations too broadly, we would have ended up with a film full of personalities versus people, or hobbits, dwarves, elves, and wizards. To find that balance then, the writers often chose to highlight the characters' distinctive traits in the writing, giving Gimli, for example, more of the humorous beats, and Legolas the balletic action beats, while directing moments, like their flight from Moria, to play in clear opposition to those traits. So perhaps we remember Gimli most clearly as the funny guy, but in scenes like that we were also shown a fiercely loyal friend and fearless warrior. And maybe we recall Legolas most vividly as the cool bowman, but there we saw an immortal elf struggling to understand the sting of death. Additionally, understanding that our connection to the characters could only occur as we spent time with them, and as much time as this jammed, packed story would allow, the writers always ensured that their scenes did more than one thing.
What about second breakfast?
So, in the book, a large dragon firework was set off at Bilbo's party, but in the film that beat was also used to introduce Merry and Pippin. And in the book, an elf named Glorfindel rescued Frodo, but in the film that sequence was repurposed to feature Arwen. And in the book, a natural storm waylaid the Fellowship in the mountains, but in the film that storm was caused by Saruman himself. Of course, it wasn't just the film's grotesque creatures, structure, or handling of the characters that screamed Peter Jackson, but its numerous, extremely imaginative action sequences. And perhaps most noteworthy among them, those that took place in Moria. Ironically, not every one of those set pieces was planned from the outset, but even while the original script simply read, "and the Fellowship runs down the stairs," period, upon seeing the miniature of that set, Jackson's cinematic mind instantly took to conceiving that entire, now iconic, sequence. While indeed this film was chock-a-block full of Jackson's inventive, energetic style, he also knew when to restrain that voice, like when Boromir picked up the ring and heard its intoxicating call. In the final cut, that moment was played in a medium close-up, allowing us to focus on the performance and hang on every one of Sean Bean's lines. But as seen in an early teaser, that scene could have looked much different and arguably much more PJ.
Boromir, give the ring to Frodo.
Which I certainly feel would have gotten in the way of the drama. Similarly, we could all day sing the praises of this film's production design as well as its fantastic blending of practical effects, miniature photography, and digital effects. But there again, what was most impressive was the delicacy with which Peter Jackson chose to handle each of those elements. So yes, he had his team at Weta Workshop design and detail every inch of a place like Hobbiton, literally having it constructed a year before cameras rolled, just to make it feel that much more aged and lived in. But then he went and photographed it simply and with restraint, using natural light and a lush but realistic color palette. And yes, he meticulously planned and executed a number of very elaborate VFX shots to sell the height difference between hobbits and men. But then, he went and framed most other scenes where that fact was all but forgotten, ensuring that the coolness of those effects never got in the way of the drama. And undeniably integral to the classic painterly look of much of this film was the work of Alan Lee and John Howe, Jackson often carbon copying their design, color, lighting, and composition. At the end of the day, each of the films in the Lord of the Rings trilogy were outstanding. The Two Towers possessing arguably the best siege battle in film history, and Return of the King containing the most emotional beats of the entire series. Nonetheless, The Fellowship of the Ring, for me, remains the only true masterpiece of the trilogy. It's a roller coaster ride of a film that knew when to terrify us and when to make us gape in wonder. That knew when to pull back and when to push in close. That knew when to be loud and when to be quiet. And it knew how to seamlessly segue from each one of those to the next. So while no film could capture every detail found in Tolkien's masterpiece, I would argue that no film should. But what Peter Jackson did was still nothing short of magic, capturing in truly cinematic ways worlds, stories, characters and themes that seem to reach beyond the edges of the frame and extend behind and before those 2 hours and 45 minutes. And because of that, his adaptation of the Fellowship of the Ring shares with its source material the most important of elements, an invitation to engage, to relate, and to imagine. And with that, we now have the first in our new Film of the Past review series. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I had an absolute blast putting this together. I don't think I can overstate just how much fun this was to dissect. As I stated already, this is my favorite film of all time, and it was a joy to review it. And for it, I must give a very sincere, heartfelt thank you to all my patrons over on patreon.com. You guys literally afforded me the time to make this review, and I would love to continue to make reviews just like this one. This one took about 2 months to put together, just chipping off a few minutes on this day, a few minutes on that day, until finally we got this end result. And the more patrons we have, the quicker these things can come out. Maybe even to a month, maybe even to a week. The sky is the limit, you never know. But even if you guys can't support me on patreon.com, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.